My sister spent $40,000 on her rehearsal dinner. Imported peonies, a string quartet, 60 place settings with gold calligraphy. She spent $0 on a seat for me. I stood at the edge of the dining room while aristocratic relatives tittered behind their champagne. Victoria smirked from her elevated chair. "Oh, we only reserved seats for important guests." My dad waved me off. "Don't make a scene, Ariana." So I didn't make a scene. I excused myself to freshen up, walked to the parking lot, pulled out my phone, and dialed the one number that would bring everything crashing down. 15 years they'd been living off land that wasn't theirs. 18 months I'd been quietly gathering proof. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., in front of 200 wedding guests, the Reynolds family would learn what happens when you steal from the wrong orphan. My name is Ariana Fields. I'm 22. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop your local time in the comments. Now let me take you back 15 years, to a red barn in Millbrook, Virginia, the last autumn I had a family. The Fields farm sat on 120 acres of Virginia countryside, rolling green hills, a red barn with a tin roof, white fence posts my grandfather Thomas repainted every spring. I was 7 years old the last autumn I spent there whole. Grandma Margaret had hands that smelled like rosemary and fresh soil. She'd walk me along the fence line before breakfast, pointing at things most people drove past without seeing. "That's clover, sweetheart. Bees love it. And see those oaks? Your great-grandfather planted those when he was 16. I didn't care about property lines or land value. I cared about the way the barn cats rubbed against my shins, and how Grandpa Thomas let me steer the tractor on his lap, his big calloused hands hovering over mine. One evening, Grandma set a wooden trunk at the foot of my bed. Oak, hand-carved, with the initials MF burned into the lid. "This is yours, sweetheart," she said. "Always." She kissed my forehead and turned off the lamp. The trunk smelled like cedar and lavender. I didn't open it for 11 years. I wish I had. That October was warm. Dad drove to Richmond for a client meeting. Mom went along because she liked the bookshop on Broad Street. They promised me pumpkin pie when they got back. Grandpa Thomas sat on the porch reading his almanac. Grandma hummed in the kitchen. The phone rang at 11 p.m. Grandpa answered. I heard one sentence from the hallway, a state trooper speaking slowly. A truck ran a red light on Route 29. Grandpa hung up the phone. He sat down on the kitchen floor, just folded, like a man whose strings had been cut. Grandma held him. I stood in the doorway in my pajamas, holding the doorframe because the house felt like it was tilting. Everything I knew ended in that kitchen. Grandpa Thomas had a stroke 6 weeks later. The doctor said it was stress and grief. He died in the same hospital where my parents' bodies had been identified. Grandma Margaret stopped humming. She stopped walking the fence line. She ate less and less, and by January, she slept more than she was awake. I'd climb into her bed and press my face against her shoulder, and she'd whisper, "You're a Fields, sweetheart. This land knows your name." She died on a Tuesday in February, quiet as snowfall. I was 7 years old, alone in a farmhouse that smelled like rosemary and grief. The funeral drew half the county. Harold Reynolds brought the biggest arrangement. White lilies, the kind you see in magazines. He was our neighbor, a real estate man with a handshake that lasted a beat too long. His wife Diane stood beside him in a black dress that still had the tags tucked inside the collar. Harold stepped up to the podium. "Margaret was like a sister to Diane. We can't let this child end up in the system." He placed his hand on my shoulder. Cameras flashed. The Millbrook Gazette ran the photo on page 1. Local businessman opens home to orphan. People clapped. The pastor nodded. A woman I didn't know squeezed my arm and said, "You're so lucky, honey." At the back of the church, an older woman stood rigid, Ruth Palmer, Grandma's closest friend. She gripped the pew in front of her until her knuckles turned white. Her mouth opened, then closed. She sat down. I didn't understand that silence then. I understand it now. Victoria Reynolds, 9 years old, stood by the church door in a plaid dress, She looked at me the way you'd look at a stray someone dragged home. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. 6 months into my new life, the pattern was clear. Victoria's bedroom had a bay window overlooking the valley, a white canopy bed, and a bookshelf lined with chapter books she never read. My room was at the end of the hall, next to the utility closet. It used to be a storage room, bare walls, one window that faced the barn. The wooden trunk sat in the corner. Harold hadn't bothered to move it because he didn't think it was worth anything. "Everyone in this family contributes," Harold told me on my first morning of chores. I was 7. He handed me a feed bucket that weighed more than my backpack. Victoria sat at the kitchen island eating pancakes shaped like hearts. By 8, I learned how to muck stalls. By 9, I could drive the riding mower in straight lines. By 10, the 4 a.m. alarm was automatic. My body woke before the clock did. Diane cooked dinner for 3. I ate whatever was left, standing at the counter while she loaded the dishwasher. "You're so independent," she'd say, as if hunger was a character trait. One night, I passed Harold's study and heard him on the phone. The door was cracked. I caught fragments. "Guardian authority over the estate assets," and "We manage everything until she's 18. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. I was 10. I didn't understand estate assets. I didn't understand guardianship. But I understood the laugh. It was the same laugh he used at cocktail parties when he talked about his stock portfolio, the sound of a man counting someone else's money. I walked back to my room and sat on the trunk. I could feel Grandma's initials through my pajama pants, raised letters pressed into old wood. Something was wrong. I just didn't have the words for it yet. By the time I was 14, the divide was architectural. Victoria, 16, drove a white Jeep that Harold bought for her birthday. She took riding lessons in Middleburg, summered in Hilton Head, and posted photos of her bedroom makeover that cost more than the tractor repairs I'd been handling since I was 12. I managed the livestock. I kept the books. Harold discovered I was faster with numbers than he was, so the farm's financial ledger became my job. I tracked feed costs, veterinary invoices, and seasonal yields in a spiral notebook. I never saw where the profits went. Harold collected the checks. At the parent-teacher conference, Harold introduced Victoria to the principal as our pride and joy. When my English teacher stopped him in the hall to mention my honor roll certificate, Harold nodded and said, "She's doing fine. She likes to keep busy." I won the school's Academic Achievement Award that spring. The ceremony was on a Thursday evening. Harold had a dinner meeting. Diane had a migraine. Victoria had plans. I accepted the certificate from the superintendent, shook his hand, and sat back down in a row of empty chairs where my family should have been. Victoria posted a family photo on Instagram that summer. Harold, Diane, Victoria, posed on the farmhouse porch, golden hour light, white fence in the background. The caption read, "My little adopted sister. So grateful we could give her a home." I wasn't in the frame. The night after the post went up, I emptied the kitchen trash and found a crumpled envelope. Return address, First National Bank of Virginia. Subject line visible through the torn edge, R.E., Fields Family Trust Account. My name was on the account. I held that envelope for 10 minutes before I put it back. I didn't understand it yet. But something shifted. A hairline crack and everything I'd been told. I turned 18 on a Wednesday. No cake. Diane left a card on the kitchen counter. Store-bought, unsigned. Harold mentioned over dinner that he'd looked into college options for Victoria, who'd been accepted to the University of Virginia. Tuition, room, board, all handled. "College isn't for everyone," Harold said when I asked about applying. "Besides, we need you here. The farm doesn't run itself." Victoria left for Charlottesville in August with a loaded SUV and a sorority bid. I stayed. I woke at 4, I fed the animals, I balanced the books, I mended fences. I was 18 years old, and I'd been running a 120-acre operation since I was 12 without a paycheck, a thank you, or a day off. That November, a cold night, I sat on my bed and pulled the wooden trunk out from under the window. I hadn't opened it since I was 7. Hadn't wanted to, maybe. The lid resisted, then gave. Inside, a bundle of family photos, a string of simple glass beads, my mother's library card, and beneath the cloth lining, a sealed envelope. Cream-colored. Grandma's handwriting. Dated 3 weeks before she died. I opened it with shaking fingers. Ariana, this land is yours. Thomas and I made sure of it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The papers are with Robert Calloway at Calloway and Associates. I read it 4 times. Then a 5th. Robert Calloway. I searched the name on my phone. The cracked screen Harold never offered to replace. Calloway and Associates, still operating in the next town over. Now run by James Calloway, Robert's son. I sat on the floor with the letter in my lap and the trunk open beside me. The cedar smell wrapped around me like a hand on my shoulder. Grandma knew. She'd always known. I drove Grandpa's old pickup, the one Harold let me use because it wasn't worth selling, 30 minutes east to a brick office building on Main Street in Marshall. James Calloway was 45, lean, with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He didn't recognize my name at first. Then he opened a filing cabinet marked R. Calloway, Legacy Files, and pulled a manila folder with a red tab. Fields, he said, sitting down slowly. Thomas and Margaret Fields. He spread the documents across his desk. A trust agreement, dated 2001, notarized and witnessed. An irrevocable trust. I learned later that means it can't be undone. Naming me as the sole beneficiary, the entire farm, every acre, every structure, every mineral right. The trustee had been Robert Calloway. When Robert died, oversight passed to his successor at the firm, James himself, who'd inherited the practice but hadn't reviewed every dormant file. This trust was never dissolved, James said. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. But someone filed a deed transfer with the county, moving the property into Harold Reynolds' name. The transfer carries your grandmother's signature. He turned the page. There it was, Margaret Fields, in cursive, at the bottom of a quitclaim deed dated June 2004. My grandmother died in February 2003, I said. James looked at me over the tops of his glasses. I know. A dead woman's signature on a document filed 15 months after her funeral. I felt the room narrow. This will take time, James said. We'll need forensic document analysis, ink testing, handwriting comparison. Don't let anyone know you were here. I nodded. I drove home. Pulled into the gravel driveway as the sun set behind the barn. Victoria's face glowed on my phone screen. A new selfie in front of the barn, captioned Home Sweet Home. I turned the engine off and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. 18 months. That's how long it takes to dismantle a lie built over 15 years. If you're careful, if you're quiet, and if you never stop smiling at the dinner table. I kept the routine. 4 a.m. wake up. Feed, muck, repair, haul. Evenings, I balanced the books at the kitchen counter while Harold watched cable news in the living room. He never asked what I was writing. He never checked. Every Saturday, I loaded the truck with produce, eggs, squash, honey from the hives I'd rebuilt, and drove to the Millbrook Farmers Market. I sold under the name A. Fields. Harold thought the market was pocket change beneath his attention. That pocket change paid James Calloway's retainer. I visited Ruth Palmer on Tuesday afternoons when Harold golfed and Diane had her book club. Ruth's cottage sat a quarter-mile down the road behind a row of dogwoods. She was 78, sharp-eyed, and she'd been holding a secret for 15 years. Your grandmother begged Harold not to change anything, Ruth told me, her hands wrapped around a teacup. He smiled and said, "Of course, Maggie." 3 months later, the deed was in his name. Ruth signed an affidavit, under oath. James filed it with the rest. The engagement announcement came at Thanksgiving. Victoria, home from UVA with a degree in public relations and a diamond on her finger, stood beside Garrett Prescott, son of Richard Prescott, whose family developed golf resorts across the mid-Atlantic. Harold beamed. This is the partnership that changes everything. Victoria clinked her glass at dinner. Garrett's family wants to develop the farm into a resort. Daddy's handling the paperwork. I passed the salad. I smiled. I said, "That sounds exciting." 18 months of smiling, 12 more days. 12 days before the wedding, James called. Forensic results came in, he said. His voice had the tight calm of a man holding a loaded document. The signature on the deed transfer is forged. The ink compound, a dye-based formulation, wasn't commercially available until 2006. Your grandmother died in 2003. I sat in the truck behind the feed store, engine off, windows down. A hawk circled the tree line. I pressed the phone hard against my ear. We now have 4 pillars, James continued. The original trust, still valid and irrevocable. The forged deed with forensic confirmation, Ruth Palmer's sworn affidavit, and 15 years of financial records showing Harold withdrew $487,000 from the trust account. $487,000. The number sat in my chest like a stone. I filed the probate challenge this morning, James said. The judge signed a temporary restraining order this afternoon. No sale, transfer, or development of Fields Farm is permitted until the court rules. 12 days. The wedding was in 12 days. The Prescotts planned to announce the resort development at the reception. 200 guests, catered on my grandmother's land. Are you sure you want to do this at the wedding? James asked. They made it public when they humiliated me in public. I'm just returning the favor, with paperwork. James paused. I'll have the process server at the venue by 2 p.m. That evening, a cream envelope appeared on the kitchen table. Victoria's rehearsal dinner invitation, hand-calligraphed, heavy cardstock, gold trim. My name was written in pencil at the bottom, cramped and crooked, as if someone had added it at the last minute. An afterthought. A courtesy no one wanted to extend. I held the envelope the way I'd once held that bank notice, carefully, turning it over in my hands. 12 days. I'd waited 15 years. 12 days was nothing. So there I was, holding a wedding invitation with my name penciled in like an afterthought, and in my other hand, a forensic report proving everything they built was stolen. If you were me, standing in that kitchen at 4 a.m. with 12 days left, would you wait for the wedding? Or would you walk into Harold's office right then and end it? Drop a 1 or a 2 in the comments. And if you're still here, hit that subscribe button. This story is just getting started. Millbrook Country Club sat on a hill above the river. White columns and wraparound porches, built to impress people who were already impressed with themselves. Harold had reserved the private dining room. 60 guests, invitation only, the night before the wedding. I drove myself. Harold didn't offer a ride. Diane didn't ask if I needed help with my hair. Victoria didn't text. I wore a navy dress I'd bought at the thrift shop in Marshall, hemmed myself on Grandma's sewing machine. Flat shoes because I'd be on my feet. Small earrings, the glass beads from the trunk, restrung on new wire. Margaret Fields beads, at her granddaughter's neck. The dining room glowed. Tea candles floated in crystal bowls. White peonies erupted from tall vases. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Each place setting was pristine. Cloth napkin, 3 forks, a name card in gold calligraphy propped against each water glass. I walked the perimeter of the room. Table 1, Prescott family. Table 2, Harold's business partners. Table 3, Diane's garden club. Table 4, Victoria's sorority friends. Table 5, extended Reynolds relatives. I counted every card, 60 settings. Not one carried my name. Victoria held court at the head table, her chair slightly elevated on a low riser someone had built just for tonight. Cream dress, pearl earrings, hair in loose waves. Garrett beside her, tanned and polished, laughing at something his father said. The room smelled like lilies and expensive perfume. Soft laughter floated between tables like smoke. Everyone belonged to someone. Everyone had a place. I stood near the entrance, holding my clutch with both hands, and scanned the room one more time. 60 names, 60 chairs. I walked toward the head table. I think there's a mistake with the seating. Victoria looked up from her champagne. The smile didn't leave her face. It just changed shape. The corners of her mouth lifted higher, but her eyes went flat. "Oh," she said, loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. "We only reserved seats for important guests." A ripple of laughter from the Prescott table. Polite, rehearsed, the kind of laugh that sounds like agreement. An aunt on Harold's side, Margaret something, a woman whose name I'd never been asked to learn, tilted her head and said, "Harold, maybe she can sit with the catering staff." More laughter, warmer this time. Diane studied her napkin. She didn't look up. Harold set down his wine glass and glanced at me the way you'd glance at a fly on a window. "Don't make a scene, Ariana. Just find a corner." 60 people watched me stand there. The string quartet kept playing. A waiter paused mid-pour, unsure whether to fill a glass that didn't exist. I held still for 3 seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. I did not cry. I did not shake. I looked at Victoria, at the pearl earrings, at the elevated chair, at the name card in gold calligraphy that read, Victoria Reynolds Prescott. And I smiled. Small. Genuine. The kind of smile that unsettles people because they can't find the wound behind it. "Of course, I'll just go freshen up." I walked through the dining room, past the bar, down the hallway, out the side door, into the parking lot where the May air smelled like cut grass and warm asphalt. I called James Calloway. "They haven't announced the deal yet. They'll do it at the reception tomorrow, move the service to the wedding. Process server will be at the venue by 2 p.m. I hung up. Inside, through the windows, I saw Victoria raise her glass. "To family. The people who truly matter." Applause. She was right about one thing. Tomorrow would be about the people who truly matter. She just didn't know which ones. I drove back to the farmhouse and went straight to my room. The storage room. The room where I'd slept for 15 years on a twin mattress with a quilt Diane once said was perfectly adequate. I pulled the trunk from beneath the window and sat on the floor, opened the lid. Cedar and lavender, fainter now, but still there. Grandma's letter lay on top, creased from all the times I'd unfolded and refolded it in the dark. "This land is yours. Thomas and I made sure of it." I closed my eyes and let the memory come. Not the phone call, not the funeral. The morning before. Grandma walking me along the fence line, her hand warm around mine, pointing at the oaks. "You are a field, sweetheart. This land knows your name." I opened my phone. The folder was labeled JC, James Calloway. Inside, photographs of every document. The trust agreement, the forged deed, the forensic report, Ruth's affidavit, the temporary restraining order, stamped and signed by Judge Harrison of the Millbrook Probate Court. 15 years of evidence, 18 months of patience. One phone call. I set the phone on the windowsill and looked out. Moonlight on the barn roof, the white fence posts, slightly crooked where I'd replaced 3 of them last spring. The field stretching dark and silent under a sky full of stars. This wasn't about hatred. I didn't hate Harold. I didn't hate Victoria. Hatred is exhausting, and I'd spent all my energy on something more useful. This was about the land. Grandma's land. My land. And tomorrow, in front of 200 people who thought they knew the Reynolds family, the truth was going to stand up and introduce itself. I folded the letter back into the trunk, lay down on the quilt, set my alarm, 4 a.m., one last time. The last morning I'd wake up in someone else's house. 5:45 a.m. I was already in the barn pouring grain into the feed troughs when the sun cracked the ridgeline. The horses shifted in their stalls. The rooster crowed from the fence post by the garden, the same post where Grandpa Thomas used to hang his hat. Inside the house, the wedding machine was running. A makeup artist arrived at 6:30, a hairdresser at 7. Diane's voice carried through the walls, sharp, directive, managing every detail of Victoria's transformation. Harold was on the phone in his study, his voice low and confident, the voice he used when money was about to change hands. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody asked what I'd wear. Nobody checked whether I'd eaten. I showered, dressed in the navy dress from the night before, the only decent thing I owned, and pinned Grandma's glass beads at my collar. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the utility sink. I looked like a woman who'd been working since before dawn. Good. By 10, the guests began arriving. The venue was the barn itself. Harold had spent $20,000 converting it for the event. String lights across the rafters, linen-draped round tables on the threshing floor, a floral arch where the hay bales used to stack, 200 chairs on land my grandmother had tilled. I stood by the barn door and watched the parade. Prescott relatives in summer suits, socialites in wide hats, a photographer with 2 assistants. Then, a gray sedan, older model, pulling into the far end of the lot. Ruth Palmer stepped out, wearing a charcoal coat buttoned to the throat. She saw me, a single nod. She walked to the back row and sat. Behind her, at the edge of the gravel lot, a black sedan parked beneath the oak trees. The driver stayed inside. I checked my phone. A text from James. On schedule. Garrett Prescott climbed the stage to test the microphone. His voice echoed off the barn rafters. After the vows, my father has a very special announcement about the future of this property. My grandmother's property. Announced from my grandmother's barn, in front of 200 people who didn't know my name. The ceremony began at noon under the floral arch. White peonies, trailing ivy, silk ribbon, all framing a view of the south pasture where Grandpa Thomas once let me chase fireflies. Victoria walked the aisle on Harold's arm. Her gown was cathedral length, seed pearls stitched into the bodice. She looked like a magazine cover. Harold wore a charcoal suit with a lavender pocket square that matched the groomsmen's ties. His posture said patriarch. His smile said victory. Diane sat front row, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She squeezed her sister's hand and whispered something that made them both laugh softly. I sat in the last row. Ruth Palmer was next to me, her handbag on her lap, her hands folded over the clasp. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The pressure of her shoulder against mine said everything. The officiant read the vows. Garrett's voice was steady. Victoria's was practiced, the kind of emotion you rehearse in the mirror until it sounds real. I do, she said, and her gaze swept the room like a searchlight, touching every face that mattered. It landed on mine for half a second. She smiled. Small, sharp, the same smile from last night. Glad you could make it. Then she turned back to Garrett. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Applause filled the barn. Doves, actual doves, were released from a box near the entrance. They scattered into the rafters, confused by the string lights. Victoria turned to throw the bouquet. She looked straight at me, arm cocked back. Try not to spill anything on your dress. Laughter from the bridal party. I held my hands at my sides. I checked my watch. 1:47 p.m., 13 minutes. The barn shifted from ceremony to reception in 20 minutes. Staff rolled out cocktail bars, lit votives on every table, and cranked up a jazz trio where the officiant had stood. 200 guests milled between stations. Raw bar, charcuterie tower, champagne fountain with the Prescott crest etched into the ice sculpture. I was seated at table 14, the overflow table, pushed against the back wall near the kitchen entrance, half hidden behind a pillar. My table mates were a caterer on break and a +1 who'd already had too much wine. Harold took the microphone first. His voice was warm, polished, the voice of a man who'd practiced sincerity until it sounded natural. To Victoria and Garrett, the future of the Reynolds legacy. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, leads to this moment. He raised his glass. 200 glasses rose in answer. I raised mine too. Then Richard Prescott, Garrett's father, stepped to the microphone. Silver-haired, tanned, the handshake and golf cart confidence of a man who turned land into money. Behind him, a projector screen lowered from a beam Harold had installed for the occasion. Friends, Family. Before we cut the cake, we have something exciting to share. The first slide appeared. Bold blue text on a white background. Fields Farm Resort. A Prescott-Reynolds joint venture. A rendering filled the screen. The barn, my grandmother's barn, had been digitally replaced with a glass and timber lodge. The south pasture was now a 9-hole golf course. The fence line, gone. The oaks, gone. 120 acres of prime Virginia countryside, Prescott said. This property has been in the Reynolds family for decades. My phone buzzed. A text from James. He's at the entrance, 2:03 p.m. I set my glass down and stood. Prescott advanced to the next slide, a 3D model of the resort, complete with a spa wing, an event pavilion, and a restaurant overlooking what used to be the creek where I'd caught crawfish with Grandpa Thomas. We project full build-out within 18 months, Prescott said. Phase 1 breaks ground this fall. Harold stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, chin lifted. The proud father, the visionary partner. Victoria leaned against Garrett at the head table, her smile so wide it looked stapled in place. A guest at table 6 raised a hand. A retired judge named Whitfield, old Millbrook family. Didn't this farm belong to the Fields family originally? The room quieted slightly. Harold took the microphone without missing a beat. Margaret Fields was a dear friend. She'd want us to honor this land by putting it to good use. Ruth Palmer's hand tightened on my wrist. I felt her pulse through her fingers, fast, angry. I gently lifted her hand off and stood up straight. My chair scraped the floor. A few heads turned. I walked toward the stage. Not fast, not slow. The navy dress, the glass bead earrings, flat shoes on the threshing floor. 200 pairs of eyes tracked me like I was a waiter heading the wrong direction. Prescott paused mid-sentence. Harold's smile held, but his eyes narrowed. I stopped 10 feet from the microphone. Excuse me, Mr. Prescott. Before you continue, there's someone at the door who'd like a word about this property. Prescott looked at Harold. Harold looked at me. For the first time in 15 years, Harold Reynolds did not have a ready answer. The barn doors opened. A man in a gray suit stepped inside, a manila envelope in his hand, walking with the unhurried purpose of someone who knows exactly where he's going. The man walked past the cocktail bar, past the ice sculpture, past the jazz trio that had stopped playing. His shoes clicked on the barn's hardwood floor. 200 guests watched him the way you watch a surgeon enter a waiting room, with the knowledge that whatever comes next will change something. He stopped in front of the head table. Harold Reynolds? Harold stepped forward. Who the hell are you? You've been served. He extended the manila envelope. Temporary restraining order from the Fauquier County Circuit Court. No sale, transfer, or development of the property known as Fields Farm is permitted pending investigation into probate fraud. The words hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Victoria shot to her feet, Toole billowing. What is this? Daddy, what is he talking about? Harold snatched the envelope. His fingers tore the seal. I watched his face as he read. The color drained from his cheeks in stages, like water leaving a bathtub, red to pink to white. Diane gripped the edge of the table. Harold, what's going on? Prescott set the microphone down on the podium with a soft thud. He didn't look at Harold. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the room. The whispers started at the back tables and rolled forward like a wave. Chairs shifted, napkins dropped. A woman at table 3 leaned to her husband and said, loud enough for me to hear, Did he say fraud? Prescott reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He didn't excuse himself. He just dialed, turned his back to the room, and spoke quietly, the voice of a man calling his lawyer. Garrett stared at the manila envelope in Harold's hands. Then he looked at his father. Then he sat down and said nothing. Nobody looked at me. Not yet. Harold recovered faster than I expected. 15 years of lying teaches a man to reset his face in seconds. He grabbed the microphone, cleared his throat, and smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, This is clearly a business competitor trying to disrupt our celebration. These things happen in real estate. Our legal team will handle it Monday morning. Please, enjoy the evening. Scattered applause. A few guests nodded, willing to believe because believing was easier than the alternative. Victoria smoothed her dress and forced a laugh. Can we please get back to my wedding? But Prescott didn't sit back down. He stood near the stage, phone still at his ear, jaw tight. When he hung up, he spoke directly to Harold. Quietly, but not quietly enough. Harold, my team needs to verify this before we proceed with anything. Richard, trust me, this is nothing. Trust is exactly what we're discussing. The side door of the barn opened. James Calloway walked in. Dark suit, leather briefcase, the composed stride of a man who'd spent 18 months preparing for this exact room. He stopped beside me and faced the crowd. Good afternoon. My name is James Calloway, estate attorney. I represent the legal beneficiary of the Fields Family Irrevocable Trust. Victoria's mascara was starting to run. What trust? There's no trust. James opened the briefcase on the nearest table. Actually, there is. Filed in 2001 by Robert Calloway on behalf of Thomas and Margaret Fields. Notarized, witnessed, and recorded with Fauquier County. The sole beneficiary is Ariana Marie Fields. 200 heads turned. Every eye in the room found me. The girl at the overflow table, the penciled-in name, the one without a seat. Harold looked at me. His mouth was open, but nothing came out. His eyes, for the first time in my life, held real fear. James adjusted his glasses. The deed transfer filed in 2004 carries a signature from Margaret Fields. Margaret Fields died in February of 2003. The barn went silent. I could see it in his eyes, that flicker of recognition. 15 years of we took you in when nobody else would, and now 200 people were watching him realize that I knew, that I'd always known. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to protect you, type I knew in the comments. And if you want to see what happens when Victoria finally understands she just married into a fraud, stay right here. James laid the documents on the head table, one at a time, like a dealer turning cards. First, the original trust agreement. Thomas and Margaret Fields, 2001, irrevocable, sole beneficiary, Ariana Marie Fields. This document has been on file with Calloway and Associates for 23 years. Second, the forged deed transfer. Filed June 2004, 15 months after Margaret Fields' death. The signature was examined by Dr. Ellen Marsh, a certified forensic document examiner licensed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Her findings: the ink compound is a dye-based pigment not manufactured before 2006. The signature is inconsistent with known exemplars. Third, a financial summary. Over the past 15 years, Harold Reynolds withdrew $487,000 from the Fields Family Trust account. These funds were designated for the maintenance and benefit of the beneficiary, Ariana Fields. Harold's hand was shaking. The restraining order trembled in his grip. This is fabricated. You can't just walk in here and... Dr. Marsh's report has been submitted to the court, James said evenly. She's available for deposition. A murmur ran through the barn. Chairs scraped. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering behind cupped hands. A woman at the Prescott table set down her champagne flute like it had gone sour. Prescott stood. His face was the color of old brick. He looked at Harold the way you'd look at a cracked foundation. You told me this property was free and clear. Harold said nothing. Victoria turned to me. Her eyes were wild, mascara streaking both cheeks. You ungrateful little... Harold grabbed her arm. Not here. But it was already here. It had been here for 15 years. Garrett removed his boutonniere and set it on the table. He didn't look at Victoria when he spoke. Dad, call Patterson. Now. Prescott was already dialing. The barn was thick with whispers when the voice came from the back row, thin, steady, and older than anyone in the room expected. I was Margaret Field's closest friend for 42 years. Every head turned. Ruth Palmer stood between the last row of chairs and the barn wall, one hand on the back of a seat for balance. Her charcoal coat was buttoned to the top. Her chin was lifted. She looked small and ancient and absolutely immovable. Margaret told me, 3 weeks before she died, that she'd placed the farm in a trust for Ariana. Ruth's voice carried across the barn without a microphone, the kind of voice that comes from decades of speaking the truth in rooms that didn't want to hear it. She said, "The papers are with Robert Calloway. It's done." She took a breath. Harold Reynolds visited Margaret when she was bedridden. He brought papers for her to sign. She refused. He told her, "I'll take care of Ariana. You don't need to worry about the farm." Margaret told me afterward, "He wants the land, Ruth, but I already gave it to my girl." Ruth paused. Her eyes swept the room. She died 3 weeks later. Harold filed the deed transfer 5 months after that. Diane Reynolds made a sound. Not a word, just a single broken exhale, like something cracking inside a wall. She covered her mouth with both hands. Victoria wheeled on Ruth. "She's lying. She's a senile old woman who—" "I signed an affidavit, dear." Ruth's voice didn't waver. "Under penalty of perjury. Can you say the same about your father's paperwork?" Silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, a single person began to clap. Slowly. Others joined. Not thunderous, not celebratory. The sound of recognition, quiet, deliberate, like a congregation saying amen to something overdue. Harold stood at the head table and did not move. For the first time in 15 years, Harold Reynolds had nothing to say. Victoria broke. Not gracefully, not quietly. She shoved her chair back, tool catching on the table leg, and stepped onto the platform Harold had built for her elevated seat. Her veil hung crooked. Her bouquet was somewhere on the floor. "You think you can just take everything from me? On my day?" She pointed at me across the room. 200 guests sat frozen between their salad forks and their champagne. "I gave you a home. We all did. And this is how you repay us?" I stood at the overflow table, my hands at my sides. "You gave me a storage room and a 4 a.m. alarm clock, Victoria." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Daddy, do something!" Harold's voice came out hoarse, stripped of its usual polish. "Victoria, stop talking. Now." But she couldn't stop. 15 years of performing the role of the perfect daughter, and the stage was collapsing beneath her feet. She grabbed the microphone from the podium and turned to the room. "This is my wedding. She's the charity case. She's nobody." At the Prescott table, Garrett slowly removed his wedding band. He set it on the white linen cloth next to his untouched dessert plate. Victoria didn't see it. She was still facing the crowd, mascara running, voice cracking. Garrett spoke without standing. "Victoria, my family's lawyers need to speak with you, separately from your father." She turned, saw the ring on the table. Her mouth made a shape I'd never seen on her before. Not anger, not performance. Understanding. The slow, sick understanding of a woman watching every prop in her life get pulled away at once. Diane stood up from her chair, eyes swollen. She looked at Harold. "You told me the farm was ours legally. You told me Margaret wanted it this way." Harold did not answer. Guests rose from their tables, quietly, one by one, like people leaving a theater before the lights come up. The unraveling was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was people making phone calls and excusing themselves and shaking their heads in the parking lot. Prescott left first. He walked past Harold without a handshake, without a word. Garrett followed 3 steps behind. At the barn door, Prescott pulled out his phone. "Pull the contract, all of it. I don't care about the deposit." The socialites were next. Quick exits, tight smiles, the kind of rapid retreat that told me every one of them would be discussing this over brunch tomorrow. A few stopped near my table on their way out. A handshake, a nod. A woman named Lydia Kensington, whose husband sat on the county planning board, touched my elbow. I donated to the Reynolds Foundation last year because Harold said it supported the farm. Where did that money go, exactly? I didn't have an answer for her. James would. The barn emptied in stages. The jazz trio packed their instruments. The caterers boxed untouched food. The ice sculpture melted under the string lights, the Prescott crest dissolving into a puddle on the floor. Victoria disappeared into the bridal suite. The door slammed. Then, muffled sobs, high and ragged, the sound of a woman whose audience had walked out. Harold sat at the head table, alone, staring at the restraining order. Diane was gone. I'd seen her leave through the kitchen entrance, head down, car keys already in her hand. James found me by the barn door. He handed me a copy of the complete filing. The hearing is in 3 weeks. You don't have to do anything else tonight. I stepped outside. The air smelled like cut hay and warm earth. Dusk was settling over the pastures. Ruth was waiting by the fence. She opened her arms. I walked into them and cried, the first time I'd cried in years. Not because it was over, because for the first time in 15 years, someone said my grandmother's name with love. The morning after the wedding, I went back to the Reynolds house to collect my things. The house was quiet the way a hospital is quiet, not peaceful, just emptied out. The kitchen smelled like cold coffee. A half-eaten bagel sat on the counter next to a stack of legal pads covered in Harold's handwriting. I walked upstairs. My room, the storage room, looked the same. Twin mattress, bare walls, one window facing the barn. I packed what was mine, 2 duffel bags of clothes, the album of family photos from the trunk, a few books. The trunk itself I carried downstairs with both arms, the oak heavy against my chest. Diane was standing in the hallway. She hadn't slept. No makeup, hair pulled back, a cardigan wrapped around her like armor that didn't fit anymore. Ariana, please. We can talk about this. Her voice cracked at the seams. Harold, he made mistakes, but we loved you. I set the trunk down, looked at her. Mrs. Reynolds, you watched me sleep in a storage room for 15 years and called it love. She didn't argue. Her eyes filled, and she pressed a hand flat against the wall, steadying herself. But she didn't argue. I picked up the trunk, my bags, the album. I didn't take anything that belonged to the Reynolds family. Not a plate, not a towel, not a memory I hadn't earned. I placed the house key on the kitchen counter. The metal clinked against the granite. The study door opened. Harold appeared, red-eyed, unshaven, wearing yesterday's shirt. He looked 10 years older than he had at the rehearsal dinner. Ariana, we need to talk. I can make this right. I looked at him. The man who shook hands for cameras and forged a dead woman's name. The court will decide what's right, Mr. Reynolds. I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it the way Grandma taught me, gently but completely. 3 days later, Harold requested a meeting, through James, formally. You don't have to go, James said. But if you want to, I'll be there. I wanted to, not for closure, not for satisfaction. I wanted to see if there was anything left of the man who'd put his hand on a 7-year-old's shoulder and promised a church full of people he'd keep her safe. The meeting was at James's office. Harold arrived in a wrinkled blazer and khakis, a man who'd dressed down to look humble but couldn't quite pull it off. He sat across the desk from me and folded his hands like a man at confession. Look, I know I wasn't perfect. He rubbed his thumb across his knuckles. But I fed you, clothed you, gave you a roof. James opened a folder. Mr. Reynolds, you also extracted nearly $500,000 from a trust fund belonging to a minor. That was operational costs. The farm doesn't run itself. I leaned forward slightly. I ran the farm, Mr. Reynolds, since I was 12. He shifted, changed tactics, softer voice, slower cadence. What if we split it? 50-50. You keep the house, I keep the development rights. We can all walk away. James didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The trust is non-negotiable. It's an irrevocable trust. The property belongs to Miss Fields, Entirely. Harold's jaw tightened. The humble mask slipped, and underneath was the same man who'd waved me away from the dinner table for 15 years. "You're making a mistake, Ariana. You'll regret this." I held his gaze. "I've spent 15 years regretting. I'm done." He stood, buttoned his blazer, walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. He didn't say goodbye. But his face, in the half-second before he turned away, that wasn't the face of a man who'd accepted losing. That was the face of a man already planning his next move. 1 week later, James called at 7 in the morning. I was repainting the fence, my fence, and I had to set the brush down to answer. Harold hired Mitchell and Strand out of Richmond, big litigation firm. I sat on the grass and pulled my knees up. "What are they filing?" "A counterclaim. They're alleging undue influence, that you or I manipulated Ruth Palmer into providing false testimony, and they're questioning your grandmother's mental capacity at the time she created the trust." The air left my lungs. I'd prepared for anger, for denial, for Harold trying to buy his way out. I hadn't prepared for him to drag Grandma's name through a courtroom. "Can they do that?" "They can try," James said. "But the trust was executed when Margaret was 65 and in good health. Her physician's records are clean. Annual checkups, no cognitive complaints, no medications that impair judgment. The notary who witnessed the signing is still alive and willing to confirm Margaret was lucid and deliberate." I exhaled. "There's more," James continued. "I contacted the district attorney's office last week. A forged signature on a recorded document isn't just a civil issue. It's a felony under Virginia code. The DA is reviewing the forensic evidence." I stared at the fence. White paint, still wet, gleaming in the sun. "I didn't want anyone to go to jail," I said. "That's not your decision, Ariana. If a crime was committed, the state prosecutes. Harold made his choices. The consequences belong to him." That afternoon, I saw it. A post on the Millbrook Community Facebook page. No names, but everyone in town knew. "Prominent local family under investigation for property fraud." 37 comments in the first hour. The paint dried on the fence while I sat in the grass, reading every one. The Fauquier County Courthouse is a brick building on Main Street, with a flagpole out front and a parking lot that was full by 8:30 in the morning. Half of Millbrook showed up. Not because they had business with the court, because they wanted to see. Harold sat on the left side with 2 lawyers from Mitchell and Strand, polished, expensive, and already sweating. I sat on the right with James. Ruth Palmer was behind me, coat buttoned, posture straight. James presented first. The trust agreement, the forensic analysis by Dr. Ellen Marsh, Ruth's affidavit, bank records showing systematic withdrawals. Harold's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Garrett, no relation to the groom, stood to cross-examine. "Your Honor, we submit that Margaret Fields may not have possessed the requisite mental capacity to execute this trust in 2001. We request a full evaluation of—" "The trust was signed before a licensed notary," James interrupted. "That notary, Mr. David Keene, is present in the courtroom today and prepared to testify that Margaret Fields was fully competent, uncoerced, and clear in her instructions." David Keene, 72, stood briefly in the gallery. He wore a bow tie and held a file. James continued. "Additionally, Margaret Fields's physician, Dr. Ann Whitaker, submitted records confirming Mrs. Fields had no cognitive impairment at the time of signing. No diagnoses, no medications, no concerns." The judge, a woman named Harrington, with reading glasses and no patience for theater, reviewed the documents for 11 minutes while the courtroom held its breath. "Mr. Reynolds," she removed her glasses, "the evidence of forgery is substantial and uncontested. The deed transfer of 2004 is voided. The Fields family irrevocable trust is reinstated in full." Harold sank in his chair. His attorney leaned in and whispered something. Harold didn't respond. "Furthermore," Judge Harrington added, "I'm referring the forgery evidence to the Commonwealth Attorney for criminal review." The gavel came down once, clean and final. The courthouse steps were warm in the afternoon sun. May in Virginia, dogwoods blooming, the air soft, the kind of day that makes you forget hard things have happened. James stood beside me, briefcase in hand. "Congratulations, Miss Fields. The farm is yours." He said it simply, no fanfare. Just the fact, stated the way lawyers do. As if transferring 120 acres and 15 years of stolen labor was routine business. A reporter from the Fauquier Times approached with a notepad. "Miss Fields, would you like to comment?" I shook my head. This was never about publicity. It was about the truth. She wrote that down anyway. Ruth Palmer came through the courthouse door, moving slowly, one hand on the railing. I met her at the bottom step. She looked at me, really looked, the way Grandma used to, as if she could see the entire map of my life in one glance. "Margaret is smiling somewhere," she said. I hugged her. She smelled like lavender soap and wool. Her hands, thin and bony, pressed against my back with more strength than I expected. Harold came out the side entrance. Diane was not with him. She'd stopped coming to the same places Harold went. He walked to his car without looking at anyone. The door closed with a heavy thud. I drove home. Home. Not the Reynolds house on the hill, the farmhouse on the flat, where the barn sits red against the sky and the fence posts line up like old soldiers guarding the pasture. I parked, stepped out, walked the fence line. The same path Grandma and I had walked 100 times. The soil was damp under my shoes. The oaks rustled. A barn cat rubbed against my shins. I put my hand on the gatepost. "I'm home, Grandma." 15 years. The land waited. So did I. 2 months after the hearing, Harold Reynolds pled guilty to 1 count of misdemeanor fraud. His Richmond attorneys negotiated the deal. 2 years of probation, court-ordered restitution of $487,000 plus accrued interest, and a permanent prohibition on managing any fiduciary assets. The felony forgery charge hovered for weeks before the Commonwealth attorney accepted the plea. It was enough. The DA's office had bigger cases. Harold was small-time, a country grifter who'd gotten caught. But the courtroom was only part of it. The Reynolds Foundation, Harold's pet charity, the one he'd used to schmooze donors and climb the social ladder, dissolved within a month. Donors pulled out. The county revoked their tax-exempt status after an audit revealed irregular disbursements. The Millbrook Country Club quietly canceled Harold's membership. His business partners stopped returning calls. Harold put the house on the market, the big colonial on the hill, the one with the view of the farm he'd stolen. It sat unsold for 10 weeks. Nobody in Millbrook wanted to buy the home of a convicted fraudster. He dropped the price twice. I drove past it once, on my way to the feed store. The lawn was uncut. The mailbox was full. A real estate sign leaned in the yard, slightly crooked, like the house itself was embarrassed. I didn't stop. There's a thing I need to say about Harold, though. On the day he was sentenced, he sat in the courtroom and stared at a family photograph he'd pulled from his wallet. Harold, Diane, Victoria, and in the background, half cropped out, a 7-year-old girl with braids. Maybe he meant well in the beginning. Maybe when he raised his hand at the funeral and said, "We can't let this child end up in the system," some fraction of that was real. Greed is patient too. It just doesn't announce itself. Garrett Prescott filed for annulment 14 days after the wedding. Grounds: fraud and material misrepresentation. His attorneys cited the property dispute, the pending criminal investigation, and, this part stung, even for me, Victoria's failure to disclose known financial liabilities. The annulment went through in 8 weeks. The Prescotts scrubbed every trace of the Reynolds name from their business filings. No statement, no press release, just silence, the expensive kind that says we never knew these people. Victoria lost her job at a PR firm in Charlottesville. The managing partner told her it was restructuring, but she'd seen the screenshots circulating on LinkedIn. Her own Instagram posts repurposed with a new caption. "This is what performative charity looks like." The photo of the farmhouse porch. The one where I wasn't in the frame, the one with the caption about being so grateful we could give her a home. It had 40,000 shares the last time I checked. I stopped checking. Victoria called me once, 3 weeks after the annulment. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice sounded different, thinner, stripped of the practiced warmth she'd always performed for an audience. "You ruined my life." I sat on the farmhouse porch. Ruth's Saturday tea was steeping inside. The barn cat was asleep on the step. "Victoria, I worked your farm for 15 years. You never worked a day. Your life wasn't ruined. It just became real." Silence. Then, smaller. "What am I supposed to do now?" I'd waited a long time for her to sound human. It was quieter than I expected, less satisfying, more complicated. "That's not my question to answer anymore." She hung up. I never heard from her again. Somewhere, in a city I don't know the name of, Victoria Reynolds started over. I hope she built something of her own this time. I hope, but I don't lose sleep over it. Diane's letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a plain envelope with no return address. 2 pages, handwritten, blue ink on lined paper. The handwriting was careful but uneven, the penmanship of a woman trying to hold herself together one word at a time. "Ariana, I told myself you were happy. I told myself we were giving you a good life. I was wrong. I knew, and I chose not to see." She wrote about the morning I arrived. 7 years old, standing in the hallway with a backpack and a stuffed bear I wouldn't let go of. She wrote about how Harold said the farm was a gift from Margaret, how she never looked at the paperwork because Harold handled finances and she handled everything else. "I never asked why you worked more than Victoria. I never asked why you didn't apply to college. I never asked why your room was the one next to the utility closet. I was complicit, not because I signed anything, because I didn't ask." I read the letter on the porch, Ruth's teacup beside me, the afternoon sun stretching across the floorboards. The paper smelled faintly like Diane's perfume, something floral and expensive that I'd smelled every morning for 15 years without ever being offered a bottle. I can't undo 15 years, but I can stop pretending they were good ones. I folded the letter and placed it inside the trunk, next to Grandma's letter. 2 women, 2 confessions, tucked side by side in cedar and cloth. I didn't write back that day. I wasn't ready. But I called James. "If Diane cooperates with the DA as a witness against Harold, does it help the case?" "Significantly." I closed the trunk. That was the first time I considered that forgiving someone and trusting them could be 2 different things. Diane made her choice on a Wednesday morning in July, walking into the Commonwealth Attorney's office in a linen dress and no wedding ring. She provided everything. Emails between Harold and his previous attorney, the one who'd helped file the forged deed, text messages where Harold discussed managing the trust situation, a household ledger she'd kept for 20 years, showing income from the farm flowing into Reynolds' accounts that funded Victoria's tuition, Harold's club membership, and the renovation of their kitchen. The DA's office called it substantially corroborative. Harold called it something else. He phoned Diane that evening. I heard about it from James, who heard it from the DA's victim advocate. Harold's exact words, "You're betraying your own family." Diane's response, according to the advocate, was 6 words. "No, Harold, I'm done betraying someone else's." The plea deal was finalized the following week. With Diane's testimony layered on top of Ruth's affidavit and the forensic evidence, Harold's attorneys abandoned any pretense of a fight. 2 years supervised probation, full restitution, permanent prohibition on fiduciary management. His name would appear in public court records for anyone with a search engine and 10 seconds. Harold Reynolds, the man who brought the biggest flower arrangement to my grandmother's funeral, would spend the rest of his life explaining Google results to everyone he met. Victoria disappeared. She deleted her social media, moved out of state, and stopped contacting Harold or Diane. Nobody in Millbrook heard from her. She became a rumor. Someone's cousin saw her waiting tables in Raleigh. Someone else heard she was in Charlotte, starting over. I thought about her sometimes, in the evenings, sitting on the porch. I wondered if starting over was harder when you'd never really started anything yourself. But that was her road. I had my own. 6 months after the ruling, Fields Farm looked like it belonged to someone who loved it. I used the restitution money to replace the barn roof, actual tin, the kind Grandpa Thomas would have picked. I rebuilt the south fence line with cedar posts, sanded and sealed by hand. I bought a second-hand tractor that ran cleaner than Harold's 10-year-old model ever did. The farm-to-table market opened on the first Saturday of September. A folding table, a hand-lettered sign, baskets of squash and tomatoes and wildflower bouquets. By the third weekend, there was a line. By the sixth, I had a regular named Dolores who drove 40 minutes from Warrenton just for the honey. People came because the produce was good. They stayed because the story had traveled. I never told it at the market, never needed to. Millbrook is a small place, and small places have long memories. I enrolled in an online program, agricultural business, through Virginia State. Classes at night, after the animals were settled. Grandpa Thomas would have liked that. He always said farming was half dirt and half ledger, and he was right about both. Ruth came every Saturday. She'd sit on the porch in Grandma's rocking chair, drink chamomile tea, and tell me stories I'd never heard. About the year the creek flooded, and Thomas sandbagged the barn by himself. About the summer Margaret won the county pie contest 3 weeks running. About the night I was born, and Thomas called Ruth at midnight shouting, "She has Margaret's eyes!" I installed a new sign at the entrance. Hand-carved oak, same wood as the trunk. I drilled each letter, routed each groove, hammered each nail. Fields Farm. I hung it on the white fence, right where Harold's sign used to be. Every letter, every nail, my name, my land. A year passed. Seasons turned over the farm the way they always had. Planting, growing, harvest, rest. I settled into a rhythm that felt inherited, as if the land itself was teaching me the tempo. Diane wrote again in November. A short note this time, not an apology, not an explanation, an invitation. Coffee. The bakery on Main Street in Marshall. No pressure, no expectations. I said yes. She looked different, smaller. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, and she wore a plain sweater instead of the designer pieces I'd seen her in for 15 years. The divorce was final. She'd moved into a rental apartment in Warrenton. She was volunteering at a literacy program and going to therapy twice a month. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, holding her mug with both hands. "I just wanted you to know I see you now. I should have seen you then." I took a sip of my coffee, set it down. "I appreciate that, but I need you to understand. We're not family. We might be something someday, but not today." She nodded. No tears, no performance, just a woman absorbing a truth she'd earned. We finished our coffee. She asked about the farm. I told her about the market, the classes, the new barn roof. She smiled, a real one, tired and honest. We shook hands in the parking lot like two people who might, eventually, learn how to share a room again. I drove home, checked my email on the porch. The acceptance letter from Virginia State's agricultural business program glowed on my cracked phone screen. Full enrollment. Spring semester. The fields were brown with winter stubble. The oaks were bare. The barn was red against a gray sky. Everything was dormant. Everything was waiting to grow. That evening, I sat on the porch with the trunk open beside me and a pen in my hand. The sun was gone, but the sky held the last violet light of the day. The barn cat, I'd named her Maggie, because she rubbed against my shins the same way the barn cats rubbed against Grandma's, curled up on the step beside me. I wrote slowly, not because I didn't know what to say, because I wanted every word to count. "Dear Grandma, I found your letter. It took me a while, but the truth was patient, just like you said. The farm is green again. Well, brown right now, because it's November, but you know what I mean. The south fence is cedar, the barn roof is tin. Ruth visits on Saturdays and drinks chamomile in your rocking chair. She tells me stories about you and Grandpa, and sometimes I can almost hear your voice underneath hers. I'm going to college. Agricultural business. The kind of thing Grandpa Thomas would have liked. I'm doing it online, so I can stay on the land. I wake up at 5 now, not 4, because I choose to. I'm 23. I sleep in your room. The quilt is wearing thin in the middle, but I can't bring myself to replace it. The sign says Fields. The land knows my name. I'm okay, Grandma. I'm really okay. I folded the letter and placed it in the trunk, next to hers. 2 letters, 2 women, separated by 16 years, and the same cedar box. I closed the lid, set the trunk at the foot of my bed, Grandma's bed now, Grandma's room, and pulled the quilt up to my chin. Through the window, moonlight on the barn roof, the white fence, pale as bone, a single owl calling from the oaks Grandpa's great-grandfather planted at 16. The Fields Farm sign caught the light and held it. I closed my eyes. Morning. I opened the barn doors the way I've opened them 1,000 times, both hands, shoulder into the wood, the hinges groaning their familiar protest. Sunlight flooded the floor. Dust motes floated in the beams like gold flakes in a stream. I walked the fence line. The same path, the same oaks, the same slight rise where the land crests, and you can see all the way to the Blue Ridge if the air is clear. Grandma used to hold my hand on this walk. I don't need anyone to hold it now. But I still reach out sometimes and touch the fence post where she'd stop and say, "Look, Ariana, look at what's ours." I don't know if Harold will ever understand what he took. Not the money, not the land, the years, the mornings I should have spent at a desk instead of a feed trough, the birthday cards no one signed, the empty chairs at my award ceremony, 15 years of being told I was lucky when I was the one keeping the lights on. I don't know if Victoria will learn to build something that's hers, something that didn't start with someone else's work or someone else's name. I don't know if Diane and I will ever sit at the same table again. I left that door unlocked. Unlocked isn't the same as open, but I know this. I am Ariana Fields. This land is mine. My grandmother's oaks still shade the south pasture. My grandfather's fence posts still hold the line. The barn is red. The sign says Fields. And no one, not a forged signature, not a missing seat, not 15 years of silence, can change that. The land remembers every Fields who loved it. Now it remembers me. So that's my story. I didn't win by shouting. I won by waiting, by gathering the truth, and by trusting the process. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand up for yourself when everyone expected you to sit down, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, check the description for the full playlist. Would you have waited 18 months like I did? Or would you have confronted Harold sooner? Type wait or confront. I'll see you in the next one.